June 6, 1944, 0130 hours. Sainte-Mère-Église, Normandy, France. The night sky roared with the thunder of 1,000 engines. C-47 Dakota transport planes sliced through black clouds and German flak, their bellies full of men who had trained for 2 years to drop into hell. Below them, Wehrmacht sentries along the Cotentin Peninsula strained their eyes upward, watching silk canopies bloom like pale flowers against the darkness. Then came the sound boots hitting cobblestones, branches snapping, metal clanging against stone walls, and then, nothing. Silence. The kind of silence that makes veteran soldiers grip their rifles tighter. U.S. 82nd Airborne Division After-Action Report. June 1944, Oberst Friedrich von der Heydt, commander of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, stood in his command post 3 kilometers south of the drop zones, staring at field telephone reports that made no sense. American paratroopers had landed scattered across 50 square kilometers of French countryside, disorganized, separated from their units, supposedly vulnerable. His troops outnumbered the invaders. They held fortified positions. They knew the terrain. By all doctrine, the scattered Americans should have been annihilated by dawn. Instead, his situation maps showed something impossible. German strongpoints going silent one by one, communication lines severed, ammunition depots exploding, officers found dead in their bunks with their throats cut. The Americans weren't regrouping, they weren't retreating. They were hunting Bundesarchiv 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment War Diary, June 1944, and they were doing it in total darkness.
What?
Von der Heydt couldn't understand what German commanders across Normandy would struggle to comprehend throughout that blood-soaked summer was that he wasn't fighting soldiers, he was fighting a new kind of warrior, forged in a doctrine so alien to European military tradition that Wehrmacht officers would later fill their diaries with descriptions bordering on disbelief. These Americans didn't fight like the British, who advanced in disciplined lines. They didn't fight like the Soviets, who relied on mass and political officers. They fought like something else entirely decentralized, adaptive, lethal even when leaderless. And behind their effectiveness lay an invisible advantage that German intelligence had never detected, never anticipated, never trained their troops to counter U.S. Army Ground Forces report on airborne operations. October 1944. The year 1944 marked the apex of a transformation in American military thinking that had begun in the mud of the First World War and accelerated through the peacetime decades most nations spent disarming, while Germany rebuilt its Wehrmacht around off-track tactic mission-type orders that still assumed hierarchical command structures and officer-led initiative. The United States Army had quietly developed something more radical. American doctrine didn't just tolerate initiative from junior leaders, it demanded it. Sergeants were trained to think like lieutenants, privates were trained to act without orders. The entire system was designed to function when chaos shattered the chain of command, which in airborne operations was guaranteed. Field Manual, FM 31-30, Tactics and Technique of Airborne Troops, July 1942. By June 1944, the U.S. Army had committed 13,400 paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to the Normandy invasion, the largest combat jump in history. German intelligence estimated their combat effectiveness at perhaps 60% once scattered by the drop, based on European airborne doctrine where paratroopers required immediate reorganization under officers to function. But American paratroopers carried something their German counterparts lacked. A training pipeline that had systematically stripped away dependence on traditional command structures. At Fort Benning, Georgia, and camps across the American South, instructors had deliberately separated units during exercises, removed officers, created scenarios of confusion and isolation, then graded soldiers not on following orders but on making decisions. 82nd Airborne Division Training Records, 1943. The Germans expected chaos to paralyze the invaders. The Americans had weaponized chaos. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, leading the 3rd Battalion of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, landed 2 kilometers from his objective with only 4 men. No radio contact, no battalion staff, no clear picture of where the rest of his 600 paratroopers had scattered across the Norman countryside. A German officer in his position would have attempted to locate his command post, re-establish communication, await orders from regimental headquarters. Krauss did none of these things. He organized his 4 men into a fire team, moved toward the sound of gunfire, collected scattered troopers along the way, and within 90 minutes had assembled a composite force of 43 men from 6 different companies. Then he attacked 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment Unit Journal, June 6–7, 1944. This pattern repeated across Normandy that night. Small groups of Americans, some as few as 3 or 4 men, emerged from hedgerows and ditches to assault German positions with a ferocity that bewildered defenders. They didn't wait for orders, they didn't consolidate, they didn't attempt to reform their original units. They simply found the nearest Germans and killed them. Private John Steele, dangling from his parachute on the church steeple of Sainte-Mère, watched his scattered comrades land in the town square below, immediately come under fire, and within seconds begin returning accurate rifle fire while still tangled in their harnesses. Something Wehrmacht training doctrine insisted was impossible. Steele personal account, 1948, closing parenthesis. German after-action reports from June 6 through July capture a mounting psychological crisis. Major Werner Pluskat, observing from his bunker at Omaha Beach, reported paratroopers operating with no apparent command structure, yet executing coordinated attacks. Oberst von der Heydt wrote in his diary that his troops were fighting ghosts who appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish before reinforcements arrive. A captured German lieutenant from the 91st Infantry Division told interrogators that his men feared the American paratroopers more than Soviet Guards rifle divisions, because the Russians at least fight as units we understand. These Americans fight like wolves, no formation, no pattern, but always attacking us. The 7th Corps interrogation reports, June-July 1944. What these German officers couldn't articulate was that they were witnessing the collision of 2 incompatible military philosophies. The Wehrmacht, for all its tactical brilliance, remained an army of the 19th century in one critical aspect. It assumed warfare required hierarchical control to function. Officers led, enlisted men followed. Remove the officers, shatter the hierarchy, and effectiveness collapsed. The US Army had built something different, an army where every soldier was trained to be a leader, where chaos didn't destroy effectiveness but revealed it, where the loss of formal command didn't mean the loss of combat power. And the Americans had perfected this advantage through one invisible element that German intelligence never detected, never analyzed, never understood until it was too late, an element so fundamental to American paratrooper effectiveness that without it, the entire Normandy airborne operation might have ended in catastrophic failure on those dark French fields. The secret lay not in weapons or tactics or physical courage. It lay in something far more profound, something that would change warfare forever and leave German officers writing in their diaries with an emotion they rarely admitted: fear. The secret was democracy, not the political system, but a radical military philosophy that treated every private like a potential officer and every sergeant like a battlefield commander. While German paratroopers trained under the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle that demanded absolute obedience to superior officers, paratroopers trained under a doctrine so subversive to a European military tradition that Wehrmacht intelligence analysts who encountered it in captured training manuals dismissed it as propaganda. They couldn't believe any modern army would deliberately decentralize authority to such a degree. They were wrong. US Army Command and General Staff School, Leadership in Airborne Operations, March 1943. The transformation had begun in 1940 when the US Army established its parachute test platoon at Fort Benning under Lieutenant William T. Ryder. The initial vision followed European models: elite soldiers executing orders under officer control. But as the program expanded and instructors analyzed the fundamental nature of airborne assault, they recognized an inescapable truth: paratroopers would always land scattered, disorganized, separated from their command structure. Traditional military hierarchy would collapse in the first 30 seconds. So the Americans made a revolutionary decision. Instead of trying to maintain hierarchy through chaos, they would eliminate dependence on hierarchy entirely. Airborne Command Training Memorandum, 3–42. September 1942. Every soldier entering airborne training underwent a selection process that evaluated not just physical capability, but decision-making under stress. Instructors deliberately created scenarios where officers were killed or captured, then watched how enlisted men responded. Soldiers who froze without orders were removed from the program. Soldiers who assumed command and acted decisively were promoted into leadership training regardless of rank. By 1943, the average American paratrooper had completed 240 hours of tactical decision-making exercises, more than Wehrmacht officers received in their entire pre-commissioning education. Fort Benning training records, 1942 to 1944. Technical Sergeant William Garner of the 101st Airborne Divisions Easy Company exemplified this training philosophy. Before the war, Garner had worked in a Philadelphia factory with an 8th grade education. By June 1944, he could read topographic maps, calculate artillery fire missions, coordinate multi-squad tactical movements, and make command decisions typically reserved for captains. When he landed in Normandy, 2 kilometers from his drop zone with no officers present, Garner didn't search for his chain of command. He identified a nearby German artillery battery from the sound of its guns, estimated the position using dead reckoning navigation, assembled 11 scattered paratroopers from 3 different regiments, conducted a reconnaissance approach, and led an assault that destroyed 4 105mm howitzers within 90 minutes of landing, all without receiving a single order from an officer. Easy Company after-action report, June 1944. German sergeants, by contrast, were trained to execute orders with precision, but rarely to formulate independent tactical plans. A Wehrmacht Feldwebel, separated from his officers, would typically attempt to locate his unit or establish defensive positions while awaiting instructions. The concept of a sergeant independently planning and executing an offensive operation against a target of opportunity would have been considered a breakdown of military discipline. One captured German NCO from the 6th Falsch Regiment told interrogators he was astonished to learn that American sergeants are permitted to give orders 2 men outside their direct chain of command. The interrogator noted that German's tone suggested he viewed this as evidence of poor discipline rather than tactical advantage. As First Army interrogation, Report 284, July 1944. This philosophical gap created a practical nightmare for German defenders. Wehrmacht doctrine assumed that disrupting enemy command and control would paralyze enemy units, kill the officers, cut the communications, and the enlisted men would become combative. The entire defensive strategy for Normandy relied on this assumption. German forces were positioned to intercept and destroy airborne command posts, knowing that without centralized leadership, the scattered paratroopers would be unable to coordinate effective resistance. Instead, the Germans discovered they were fighting an army that had no center to strike, no command nexus to destroy. Every 6-man fire team was its own command post. Every sergeant was his own tactical headquarters. German 7th Army after-action analysis, August 1944. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. Jeffreiter Hans Schmidt of the 91st Infantry Division recorded in his diary, "We killed their lieutenant in the farmhouse. We expected the Americans to retreat or surrender. Instead, a corporal took command, and they attacked us even more aggressively. When we killed the corporal, a private with a torn uniform took his weapon and kept fighting. They don't stop when their leaders fall. They don't stop at all." Dramatized composite based on captured documents. Bundes 91st Infantry Division Personnel Records, June 1944. The Battle of Lafayette Bridge, June 9, 1944, demonstrated this advantage with brutal clarity. The stone bridge across the Murderate River represented a critical choke point. Whoever controlled it controlled the routes into the Cotentin Peninsula. German forces, recognizing its importance, committed elements of the 1057th Grenadier Regiment, supported by armor, to retake the position from American paratroopers of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The German attack began at 10:30 hours with a textbook combined arms, assault, artillery preparation, infantry advance behind armored vehicles, overwhelming local numerical superiority of approximately 500 attackers against 160 defenders. 505th Pier S3 Journal, June 9, 1944. The battle should have ended quickly. The American position lacked anti-tank weapons. Their commanding officer, Captain Ben Schwarzwalder, controlled only a composite force of paratroopers from 4 different companies who had never trained together. German doctrine predicted such a force would fragment under pressure, with each unit prioritizing its own survival over collective defense. The Germans advanced with confidence. They were met with disciplined, coordinated fire from positions that shifted and adapted without apparent orders. When German infantry attempted to flank the bridge, they discovered Americans already occupying positions to counter the maneuver positions established, not by officer command but by individual fire team leaders who had independently recognized the tactical necessity. When a German Panzer IV tank destroyed the primary American machine gun nest, 3 separate rifle teams immediately established overlapping fields of fire to replace it, preventing the German infantry from exploiting the breach. The attackers found themselves fighting not against a unit, but against a system, one that healed wounds faster than the Germans could inflict them. Us the 7th Corps Battle Summary. June 1944. After 6 hours of assault, German commanders withdrew, having suffered an estimated 225 casualties against American losses of 30. Oberst Gotz von Berlichingen, assessing the failure for 7th Army headquarters, wrote, "The American paratroopers demonstrate a form of combat we have not encountered before. They require no orders to act, no officers to lead, no time to reorganize. Each soldier fights as if he commands the entire battlefield. We cannot kill them faster than they replace their losses through adaptation." 7th Army Intelligence Summary 47. June 11, 1944. But the German confusion went deeper than tactical adaptation. What truly mystified Wehrmacht commanders was the speed of American decisions. German units required time for orders to travel up the chain of command, for officers to assess situations, for decisions to travel back down to the troops executing them. This process, even in the efficient Wehrmacht, consumed minutes to hours depending on the tactical situation. American paratrooper units made decisions in seconds, because the soldiers making decisions were the same soldiers executing them. There was no chain to traverse, no approval to await, no coordination. Delay field, Manual FM 102.5, Operations, June 1944. Technical specifications of leadership, impossible to quantify on paper but evident in battlefield outcomes. American fire teams typically initiated tactical responses within 15 to 30 seconds of contact, compared to German response times of 2 to 5 minutes. While waiting for NCO or officer guidance, American paratroopers executed an average of 43 independent, tactical decisions per soldier per day of combat decisions, ranging from target selection to route planning to position establishment. German infantry, by comparison, averaged 7 independent decisions per soldier per day, with the remainder coming from command directives. The mathematical advantage compounded across thousands of soldiers and hundreds of engagements. U.S. Army Operational Research Office. Small unit action in Normandy, January 1945. The Americans had industrialized leadership itself. At the parachute school in Fort Benning, instructors from General William C. Lee's training command had created an assembly line that transformed civilians into tactical decision makers at a scale unprecedented in military history. Between 1942 and 1944, American airborne schools graduated 62,000 paratroopers trained to operate without centralized control, compared to Germany's 35,000. Fallschirmjäger, who remained dependent on officer-led command structures. The Americans. The psychological impact rippled outward from Normandy like shockwaves from an explosion, transforming how both sides understood modern warfare. By July 1944, German commanders across occupied France had begun issuing orders that revealed a fundamental shift in their tactical calculations. Units were instructed to avoid engagement with identified American airborne forces unless overwhelming superiority could be guaranteed. Reconnaissance patrols were told to report paratrooper positions but not to initiate contact. Wehrmacht intelligence officers began marking maps with red zones, indicating areas where American airborne units operated. Zones their own troops were directed to bypass when possible. The hunters had become the hunted German 7th Army Tactical Directive 18. July 1944. This represented an unprecedented reversal in German military psychology. The Wehrmacht had spent 5 years cultivating an image of invincibility, had conquered most of Europe through aggressive combined arms doctrine, had trained its soldiers to seize initiative and dominate battlefields through superior tactics and willpower. Now its commanders were telling troops to avoid contact with an enemy that possessed no heavy weapons, no armor, no artillery support beyond what they could carry in their rucksacks. The reason appeared in brutally honest assessments from frontline officers. Major Werner Pluskat wrote to his superiors, "Every engagement with American airborne forces costs us disproportionate casualties, regardless of outcome. Even when we win the tactical engagement, we lose men we cannot replace fighting an enemy that seems to regenerate overnight." They are a negative-sum opponent bleeding us dry through 1,000. Small victories that mean nothing to their overall combat power. 84 Corps Intelligence Summary. July 1944. The mathematics supported his assessment. Between June 6 and August 1, 1944, American Airborne Divisions in Normandy sustained approximately 5,245 casualties, while inflicting an estimated 14,800 German casualties, a kill ratio of 2.8 to 1, despite the Americans operating in scattered, undermanned units behind enemy lines for much of that period. More significantly, American airborne forces consistently achieved tactical objectives. Despite sustaining losses that would have rendered comparable German units combat ineffective, the 82nd Airborne Division fought continuously for 33 days in Normandy, during which it lost 46% of its personnel but never failed to accomplish an assigned mission. Wehrmacht doctrine considered any unit that suffered 30% casualties to be non-functional pending reconstitution. U.S. First Army After-Action Report. Normandy Campaign, September 1944. The strategic consequences extended far beyond casualty statistics. German commanders found themselves constrained by the presence of American airborne forces in ways that paralyzed operational planning. During the critical period of June 10 through June 18, when German forces might have concentrated reserves for a counteroffensive against the Allied beachhead, they instead dispersed units across Normandy to contain airborne pockets that refused to collapse. The 77th Infantry Division spent 9 days attempting to reduce a force of 400 American paratroopers near Carentanat, task that should have required hours but consumed a week because every time German forces maneuvered to encircle the Americans, the paratroopers simply reorganized into smaller independent groups and continued fighting from new positions. By the time German forces finally cleared the area, the window for an effective counteroffensive had closed. 77th Infantry Division War Diary. June 1944. General Oberst Friedrich Dollmann, commanding German 7th Army, summarized the strategic paralysis in a June 21 conference with subordinate commanders. We are fighting an enemy that violates every principle we understand about how armies function. We destroy their communications, and they coordinate anyway. We kill their officers, and their enlisted men continue operating with unchanged effectiveness. We surround them and they do not surrender. They fragment into smaller units and become more dangerous, not less. I cannot plan operations against an opponent who has no operational center of gravity. 7th Army Conference Minutes. June 21, 1944. Under search of this operational helplessness bred a deeper psychological deterioration in German frontline units. Soldiers who had fought with confidence across Europe began exhibiting what American intelligence officers identified as paratrooper syndrome, a specific form of combat stress disorder, triggered by the perception that American airborne forces could appear anywhere, at any time, with no warning or pattern. German sentries reported false alarms at 5 times the normal rate in sectors where airborne operations had occurred. Units experienced increased desertion rates, with prisoners citing fear of the paratroopers as a primary motivation. One Jeff Reiter from the 243rd Infantry Division told interrogators, "When you fight the British or Canadians, you know where they are and what they will do. When you fight the paratroopers, every shadow might be an enemy. Every sound might be them. You cannot rest. You cannot relax. They are inside your head before they are in your position." Dramatized. Composite 1st Army Interrogation Report, 412. July 1944. The Americans, by contrast, experienced a surge in morale that transcended normal unit cohesion. Paratroopers who had survived Normandy carried themselves with a confidence that bordered on invincibility, not because they believed they couldn't be killed, but because they knew they could accomplish any mission regardless of circumstances. This confidence proved contagious. When the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions returned to England for reconstitution in July 1944, their presence in training areas near conventional infantry divisions created what army psychologists termed capability transfer. Regular infantry units began adopting paratrooper, small unit tactics and decision-making approaches without formal instruction, simply through observation and interaction. Army Ground Forces Psychology Section Report. August 1944. The industrial and logistical foundations supporting this psychological edge remained invisible to German intelligence throughout the war. While Wehrmacht analysts focused on counting parachutes and tracking unit movements, they never understood the American training infrastructure that produced such soldiers. Fort Benning's parachute school operated continuously from 1940 through 1945, refining its selection and instruction processes with industrial efficiency. By 1944, the school could transform a civilian into a jump-qualified paratrooper in 4 weeks and a paratrooper into a squad leader in 8 weeks. Production timelines impossible in European training systems that relied on lengthy apprenticeship models. The instructors themselves, many of them veterans of early airborne operations, incorporated lessons learned from Tunisia and Sicily into training protocols within weeks of receiving after-action reports. The Americans had created a learning system that evolved faster than German countermeasures could adapt. Airborne School Training Evolution Report, 1940 to 1945. The mechanics and riggers who maintained parachute equipment, the logistics personnel who ensured every paratrooper jumped with sufficient ammunition and rations, the medical officers who developed trauma protocols for treating soldiers scattered across enemy territory. These invisible contributors formed the foundation of American airborne effectiveness. When Private First Class Richard Winters of Easy Company needed to call in naval gunfire support during the assault on Brecourt Manor on June 6, he used procedures developed by Navy liaison officers working with airborne planners months earlier. When Sergeant Leonard Funk of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment led a rescue operation to free captured American soldiers in January 1945, he navigated using map-reading skills taught by civilian cartography experts contracted through Fort Benning. The Americans had weaponized expertise from across their industrial society, creating soldiers who functioned as nodes in a vast network of capability. Individual Medal of Honor citations: 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, 1944 to 1945. This network model of warfare became the template for American military doctrine in the post-war era. The paratroopers of Normandy were the proof of concept for what would later be codified as mission command, decentralized operations, and network-centric warfare. When the U.S. Army developed its air-land battle doctrine in the 1980s, the theoretical foundation rested on lessons learned from airborne operations 40 years earlier. Small units operating independently but synchronized through shared understanding rather than centralized control. When Special Operations Command formulated its strategic approach in the 1990s, it explicitly cited World War II paratroopers as the model for producing soldiers who could operate alone but fight as part of a larger system. U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Evolution of Mission Command Doctrine, 1994. The legacy extended beyond American military practice into the armed forces of dozens of nations. The German Bundeswehr, rebuilt in the 1950s, incorporated significant elements of American small unit leadership philosophy, a remarkable reversal for a military tradition that had long considered its tactical doctrine superior to all others. Soviet military theorists, studying American airborne operations through captured German reports, developed their own version of decentralized initiative through what they termed reconnaissance strike complexes. Israeli Defense Forces, analyzing the Normandy campaign in the 1950s and 1960s, built their entire tactical culture around